African Americans faced a great deal of segregation, violence, and all-around awful discrimination from the Great Depression to the 1970s. For these 40 years, the African Americans had several different approaches to this discrimination against them. They changed their goals and strategies in order to stop segregation and to create equal civil rights for all races. The African Americans' goals and strategies were a direct result of the success they had for themselves. Different strategies allowed room for better success, and they did just that. During the Depression, African Americans were discriminated against heavily in the workplace. Blacks faced unemployment of 50% or more compared to 30% for white workers. An act was created called the National Recovery Act, which was made to help give Americans jobs. The NRA rarely employed blacks, and if they were hired, the companies maintained racist wages as much as they could. Blacks were either excluded or forced to organize in separate unions. If blacks tried to organize their own, would find themselves as a target for lynch mobs. African Americans faced very heavy racism in this time. One strategy that African Americans took was striking. These strikes had the intention to raise awareness about the inequalities of work. Another strategy was through court cases. One of the most famous court cases, called the Scottsboro Trials, dealt with 9 African American boys who were accused of raping 2 white women. The defendant of the African American boys made history. It was the first time a black man didn't face the death penalty for raping a white woman. After the court case, one of the women came out and said it was not true that these 9 men raped her. This proved to be key in the civil rights movement. After the Great Depression, World War II was the next major event in American history. One of the major strategies of this time was the Double V campaign. The Double V campaign was a push for civil rights during World War II. It essentially was fighting for victory in the war and to fight for victory for the African Americans. It was a form of propaganda to bring America together to fight on 2 fronts. This was important for civil rights movement because it sparked a bigger push for civil rights. The Double V campaign was an effective strategy because it kicked off the huge civil rights push into the 1950s and 60s. The goal was to start making integration happen and for segregation to stop. Going into the 50s and 60s, the main strategies and goals for African Americans were to start winning, in a sense. Or in other words, their goal was to make a bigger difference than ever before. There were several different strategies that played huge roles in the civil rights movement. The 1954 Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education was a pivotal point in the civil rights movement. This Supreme Court case dealt with segregation in schools and how they needed to be integrated. The decision came down to segregation being unconstitutional to have separate schools between the whites and the blacks. After this court case, instead of schools starting to integrate, a lot of schools started to close. Another strategy was through the Montgomery bus boycott. This boycott is one of the most iconic civil rights movements. It started from Rosa Parks deciding to not move to the back of the bus where the colored people sit. This was a political campaign with the hope to stop the continual segregation that is happening throughout the United States. This sparked a huge bus boycott that proved to be one of the first big successful actions of the African American civil rights movement. It started in 1955.